I'm Larkin Powell, a wildlife biologist in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska. And it's a privilege for me to share with you today about sandhill cranes and about birds in the Great Plains. I'm going to invite you, as we talk about these unique birds, to come with me, and we're going to go on a sacred journey. I want to invite you into some really neat spaces with these birds, to the extent that we can start to think like these birds think, and we can think about the relationship that we have with sandhill cranes as human beings. My experience with sandhill cranes, my story starts when I was in college in southern Iowa. I grew up in southern Iowa, and my dad informed me that rather than going on spring break with friends that were headed to the ski slopes in the Rockies or down to the coastal beaches along the Gulf, that he and I were headed to visit the sandhill cranes along the Platte River west of our house in Nebraska. I wasn't incredibly excited about it. It seemed like an adventure, but it was different than my friends and what they were doing. But we went to a blind and we saw the sandhill cranes in the morning lift off as the sun rose and lift off into the sky. And at that moment, everything changed for me. And I think both my father and I saw that as a moment that we'll always remember, because of the way that we were immersed in that experience with thousands and thousands of birds as they reached up into the sky that morning. Those are the kind of moments that I think we can all have with birds in the Great Plains, and the sandhill crane is a perfect example. So I want to share some images with you as we go through and talk about sandhill cranes and these sacred spaces and the journeys we take through them. The book Great Plains Birds that I authored is part of a series of birds on many topics in the Great Plains: Indians, geology, bison, literature, etc. All put together by the University of Nebraska Press and the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska. Great Plains Birds is divided into sections. One is about the birds, one is about the place, the problems, the hope, the experience. And it's that order that we're going to go through today as we talk about sandhill cranes. And you'll see over here above this, on the cover of Great Plains Birds, there are some sandhill cranes flying as silhouettes behind this long-billed curlew on the cover. Sandhill cranes are just a very unique, fun to watch, fun to view, fun to think about species. Allison Johnson made some illustrations for Great Plains birds to distinguish and isolate some behaviors that several birds of interest have. And one of those was the stick throwing behavior of sandhill cranes. Mostly males will grab a corn cob, a stick, corn stalk, anything stick-like, and hurl it to the sky as they throw their wings back. And they'll do this in front of their mate, usually, or a potential mate, but often this is a pair bond strengthening behavior. And there's a lot of dancing that happens in the spring as the sandhill cranes go north. And you'll see this behavior and other behaviors where they're leaping and dancing and throwing their heads back and making a cackle. And many of those behaviors are intended to focus and strengthen the bond that is between the pair of birds that are together as they're migrating. You can think of things, I can think of ways that, I try to be a good husband or show off for my wife to strengthen the bond that we have. And I think it's fun to think about birds and humans as doing similar things for similar reasons sometimes. The Great Plains is a unique region. It's outlined here in black, and you can see that compared to the rest of the country, the Great Plains is a unique place. The light tan on this diagram is is grasslands, and the dark browns are farmlands, row crop areas. And you can see that the Great Plains is made up of primarily those two colors. There's an area here in the central part of the Great Plains, though, that is our focus today, and that's the Platte River Valley. And you can see the North Platte and the South Platte coming together, and then the Platte River going east, going from west to east. And these west to east rivers, the Platte being one of the most important, but there's several other west to east rivers as you go through the Great Plains. Even the Missouri functions in this way as it heads north and heads west to its source, as it would go upstream to the source of the Missouri. And those east to west rivers function as a ladder, step ladder for birds that are migrating. This central part of the United States for bird folks like myself is known as the Central Flyway. On the left is a map that shows the actual political boundaries of these flyways that have been established for wildlife biologists to manage migratory birds in distinct units, distinct sets of managers managing birds that are functionally flying through those areas. And on the right is an example of the Central Flyway with several little side paths and things that waterfowl and other migratory birds, such as the Sandhill crane, take as they come up the Great Plains. And you can see that they come right up through Nebraska. Sandhill cranes come up right through the middle of the state. And so they're in their wintering grounds down here in the Texas plains, the Gulf Coast, and down into Mexico as well. And then they're flying north up to breeding areas that reach even into Siberia. These are important areas, and we're going to come back and talk about that as an adventure that the birds are having in just a second. But you'll notice that there's a key stopover site here, right along the Platte River in Nebraska. So why do the cranes stop along the Platte River in Nebraska? Every crane that migrates north, almost all of those birds will stop for 2 to 3 weeks along the Platte River Valley in central Nebraska. Why do they stay so long? Ducks and geese don't stay that long. What is it about Sandhill cranes? Well, they're migrating a little earlier than a lot of the ducks and geese, for one thing. And I call it an insurance policy. They're staying here to load up on fat. They're finding that fat in the form of mostly corn in the Platte River Valley. And when they look ahead in their little bird minds, what they would tell you if they could talk to you is that they're afraid of what they're going to find up on the breeding grounds. Perhaps when they get to northern Canada, Alaska, Siberia, those areas are going to be frozen over and there won't be any insects. It's going to be hard to stick their bill down in the ground to find invertebrates to eat. And so they're going to need some food, some energy to tide them over, because there's not actually going to be any food for them to get there. So they stop for 3 weeks along the Platte to forage in the areas around the Platte River because they are important food sources for those birds and have been for centuries. What you can see on the right side here is by the dates across the bottom, dates from January 1st that the birds are in Nebraska. If we sample birds in early March compared to April, we'll find that the birds are fatter as the time goes on. They're putting on fat as they're here. And this applies to both males and females equally in the spring on the way north when they're in Nebraska. And the males are in the solid line and the females are in the dotted line. When they get to Alaska, here's some birds that have just arrived in Alaska. So now it's day 120. That would be what, like May 1st. And now they've arrived in Alaska and the males start to decrease, but look what happens to the females. They decrease like crazy. Why do females act so differently? They lose fat so much faster than males. And the reason is, of course, they're doing something female-ish. They've got eggs to produce, okay? That's an energetically costly thing. And they're sitting on the nest more than the male is. And that means they're not able to forage as much. So they're expending energy without getting as much energy. And so they really need those fat reserves to tide them over to provide the energy. Think of it like just a big block of snacks that they can have with them there at the nest while they're incubating those eggs. And so that's why they stay in Nebraska. The area that they're stopping in along the Platte looks a lot different now than it used to. So here we have the Platte River right along Interstate 80 here. And you can see all these farm fields, these lush green areas are corn and soybeans in the summertime. We've got some light grasslands to the north, headed up, working our way up to the Sandhills region. And we've got some grasslands, more grasslands away from the river to the south as well. But if you're in this area, you know that every one of these circles has a center pivot irrigation platform in it, where the irrigation rig is spinning around a central pivot, and it makes a circular area in the field that gets watered, and therefore is much more productive than the dry land agriculture around it. And so we see this series of circles. Now, obviously, that wasn't here 200 years ago. It actually wasn't even here 100 years ago. This area is dramatically changing quickly. But it turns out, as we'll learn in just a second, that's good for Sandhill Cranes because they like to eat corn. So they've arrived in Nebraska, they're along the Platte, they rise up out of the river in the morning and they go out to feed. They've been in the river overnight, standing in knee-deep water to protect themselves against coyotes so that they've got a safe roost spot in the middle of this river that's coming down in the spring from the Rockies. And so now we're out to eat. Where do they eat? Well, a lot of times you'll find them in cornfields. And what we can see here in the top of this figure that some biologists have gathered is that mostly what they're eating in these cornfields is corn. And that's obvious, but the other point is that there's very little else for them in those cornfields than corn, just a little bit of insects. They're primarily going for the corn. If we look at native grasslands and alfalfa fields that are sprinkled in around those cornfields in the area, we find that those are actually really important because corn is missing some amino acids and other nutrients that are important for sandhill cranes, and they get those by eating invertebrates, earthworms, snails that are down in the little wet sloughs in these near river grassland areas, and insects. And those things are important. They also have protein, and they're able to turn that into fat and turn that into energy. So these areas are both very important for them. If some of these grasslands disappear, we're in trouble. It can't all be corn, but the amount of cornfields is actually not a bad thing for sandhill cranes for the time being. Now, problems. The problem section of the Great Plains book. Let's apply that to sandhill cranes. If we think of grassland birds in general in the Great Plains, there's a lot of recent news about the declines, the dramatic declines in the last few years since 1970 in grassland birds. And here's some data that I've arranged on western meadowlark, our state bird here in Nebraska, as well as ringneck pheasants, a popular game species, and grasshopper sparrows. And you can see that they all have similar declines through time during that period of time. And so this is a problem for many species. The disappearance of grasslands and the intensive farming of corn and soybeans can be a problem for many species. In fact, William Stolley in 1907 wrote this passage: "All rivers and creeks were alive with beaver, otter, mink, and muskrats and raccoons, along with various kinds of geese, ducks, pelicans, swans, and other water birds. These birds of passage appeared by the thousands every spring and fall. Cranes," here we go, gray, that's the sandhill cranes, and white, that's our endangered whooping cranes, and several species of woodcocks were also seen in large flocks. All this had changed entirely in 50 years that had passed. The above mentioned birds and animals, whose great multitudes gave the land its peculiar character and appeal in those early days, have decreased in numbers to almost the vanishing point. Now, William Stolley had immigrated with his family from Germany when he was just a boy in the 1850s. So he's writing this 50 some years after he had come to the United States, and had seen changes That was over 100 years ago, and we know there's been changes since that time as well. Some of the changes that have occurred more recently, but had started to occur just shortly after Mr. Stoley wrote that, can be seen on the left side of this diagram. The Platte River has very different flows water-wise than it used to. We're taking water out for irrigation. We're holding water back in dams for reserve for irrigation and recreation. The way that we're managing the very few prescribed burns and things that we would normally have, and the main thing is a lack of spring floods that would come down the Platte River, scour off all these sandbars. And on the left, you can see what happens when you take away that disturbance. Trees grow up. To a sandhill crane, that's not a good place. The left side of this picture, these pictures are provided by Audubon because of their rose sanctuary near Gibbon, Nebraska. And the left side of the diagram shows areas that are not a great place for sandhill cranes to be. Those trees represent predators. Those trees represent a lack of being able to see the sides of the river, to see if danger's coming. And they're going to be very shy to land and roost in the waters that are in between the sandbars there, with the submerged sandbars that are under the water on the left. On the right, you see an area that has been restored. NGOs, non-government organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Whooping Crane Trust, state and federal agencies, Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all working together to restore habitat. And you can see that we've got trees removed from those sandbars in the midst of the rivers, trees removed from the side of the rivers in many cases. Much more appealing place for sandhill cranes. It's also great for least terns and piping plovers, two other species of concern that use those sandbar habitats, and they actually stay in Nebraska and nest in the summertime here, while the sandhill cranes leave us. Sandhill crane populations are the exact opposite of those declining populations that we saw for some of these other species. Starting in the 1980s here on the left side, you can see that we've gone from about 300,000 cranes using the Central Flyway coming up through the Central Flyway past the Platte River to now in the close to 800,000 sandhill cranes as a 3-year average. We've got a lot more cranes than we used to, and that's mostly the result of corn supporting those populations. They're doing quite well. The little dotted lines here are showing you the range. That's the goal. Within those dotted lines is the goal that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has for this mid-continent sandhill crane population. And so we're actually above that right now. And there can be some current concerns about having a population that's too high. We start thinking about crop damage up in Canada as the birds are staging to come south. Barley fields that are overwhelmed by sandhill cranes and farmers that aren't too happy with them in that case. We start thinking about disease transmission when populations get large. So there's we're never happy, are we? But the idea is the sandhill cranes are not showing the same declines that other birds that depend on grasslands and wetlands are showing. So the sandhill crane is a species because of all of these connections that really show us the issues that we have with our landscape as well. They're a good species to think about as we think about some of the trends that are happening, as we think about our farm subsidy programs that provide habitat on the landscape and what we can do to put that habitat back on the landscape and restore habitats like we saw earlier in the sandbar habitat in the Platte River. We can think about intensive agriculture, and here's one of those center pivot irrigations on the center right side of this screen. And we can think about the relationship that we have and the need for food for our world, but also the need for birds like sandhill cranes, birds like western meadowlarks to live in that world. And the complications where sometimes it's good for others and not good for some species. And we can think of things like tree encroachment. This is at the bottom of the screen here is red cedars encroaching in areas that are away from the Platte River here in Nebraska. But tree encroachment on those sandbars along the Platte is very similar. And we can think about lost capacity for grassland birds. We can think about lost capacity for our grazing livestock animals that are important too. And so sandhill cranes really are in the midst of it all. What can we do? Well, there's hope. Sandhill cranes are not declining, so it's not we're not in a sob story here. But for birds in general, where we may have some despair about some of the numbers we see, I always want to encourage people that there is hope. With sandhill cranes, we can do a couple things that really do have an impact. If you're interested in sandhill cranes, participate in ecotourism. Buy a ticket to go visit one of the blinds and spend an enjoyable evening becoming part of the sacred space along the Platte River. And the great thing is that your price of your ticket, whatever charity group you're working with to visit the Platte at that point, they're going to turn that back around and put that in habitat restoration to make sure that others can see that site in the future as well. And you can also buy a duck stamp. Waterfowl hunters have to buy a duck stamp, but non-hunters can also buy them. And that money, 99% of the money that you spend on a duck stamp goes directly to habitat restoration for things like wetlands. And so that's another way, that's a fun way to collect some great artwork that's on the duck stamp every year that changes, but also to support conservation. And so I just want to end thinking about this experience. And I want to think about the sacred space. The last portion of the Great Plains book is filled with places from the provinces in Canada all the way down the Great Plains to Texas that are great places to see birds. And there's some 8 places in each state or province that you can visit and have a great time immersing yourself with the birds. In the case of the sandhill cranes, the Platte River Valley, in my opinion, is the place to do it. Sandhill cranes stop other places too, but this is where there's such huge numbers and they all come together in these unique coming back to the roost and leaving the roost in the morning and the evening. You can also, in addition to going to places like Rose Sanctuary and the Whooping Crane Trust, Blinds Nature Conservancy, you can also visit some free to visit sites. And the Central Platte Natural Resource District, the Central Platte Natural Resource District has a website. And if you Google that, you'll find some great information about how to get to a handful of sites that have been put up easily for people that have parking lots, elevated platforms for you to watch the cranes from, that are safe to watch the cranes from. The cranes land every day just after sunset. And as these birds are whirling through the air, they're all above the river, waiting for the first brave crane to land in the river. And you watch for it. And that one crane will land in the river. And as soon as it does, the rest of the cranes will start to pile in and follow. And they're going to find those ankle-deep areas, crane ankle-deep areas, that are going to make a nice roost for the evening. That's been happening right after sunset. The sun has to go down, and it happens that way, and it's been happening that way for centuries. I want you to think about the calls that you can also hear. I wish I could play an audio tape for you of the chirrs that are just omnipresent as the birds are circling, and they start to fill the space with music, with crane music. They're calling to each other, of course. That's why they're calling. They're happy to see each other, we like to think, as they come back from their individual fields and they join the flock in the evening. But I also like to think that that call is partially for us. And maybe it's just a reminder that these spaces exist and that these connections with birds exist and that they're special and that we can't take them for granted. Being a part of these kind of things is good for us. And Willa Cather actually wrote a quote that in My Antonia that speaks to this. And she wrote, "That is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. And the Sandhill Crane Migration is an event in which you can be dissolved. The invitation is there. And I hope that you enjoy your time along the Platte River. I hope you get to see some cranes, and I hope you enjoy being a part of all of this. Thanks for joining me. I hope it's been fun for you to learn just a little bit more about Sandhill Cranes, and I wish you the best.